Welcome to the 12th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through a script I've written that incorporates the past 8 tutorials on generating reports using Tableau Server Client by combining them to produce a single master report. Before jumping into the script, allow me to speak to the usefulness of a master report. A master report allows me to acquire a comprehensive understanding of my Tableau server by generating a report that covers most content or object types. For flows, data sources, and workbooks, the report allows me to determine how many of each are published to my Tableau server, who owns the content, where it is located, how popular it is, and when it was created and last updated. For users and groups, the report allows me to determine how many of each are maintained on my Tableau server, which users are members of which groups, and whether each user is a creator, explorer, or viewer. For projects, the report allows me to determine how many projects or folders are maintained on my Tableau server, the content of each of those projects, and the permissions model employed within the folder. For subscriptions and favorites, the report allows me to determine how many of each are maintained on my Tableau server, who owns each subscription or favorite, which content pieces are highly subscribed to or favorited by the user base. Keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list of content and object types, nor is it an exhaustive list of the things a master report enables you to do. I will now jump over to Visual Studio Code to review the script I've written that brings together the concepts covered in the past 8 tutorials. For the sake of time, your experience, and my fingers, I will not be typing this one out live. Instead, I will briefly explain each portion. If you watched the previous 8 tutorials on generating reports, then a good amount of the script's code should be familiar to you. Let's get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So starting from the top, importing my packages, date time, import date time and time zone. This is particularly useful for the end where I'm going to write my output to an Excel workbook. So this master report is going to be written to an Excel workbook. And what I'm going to do for each master report that's generated is I'm going to append the date and time for which the report was generated. That's going to allow me to distinguish one master report from another. Say I run this on a daily frequency, monthly, so forth. I don't want to overwrite a previous master report. And as far as pathlib goes, I'm using pathlib to create a path object that's going to be used in Pennis's Excel writer to write those individual sheets within the workbook. I'm also using datetime for various calculations that we'll get to here in a moment. All right, continuing down from the top, using keyring to store and retrieve my personal access token. What I would recommend you doing if you're not familiar with how this works, see my second tutorial, connecting to your server. In that video, I go through or walk you through connecting to your Tableau server for the first time. You don't have to use keyring. In reality, what you could do is just hard code your personal access token that you generate on the front end of Tableau server in your account settings. You could populate that here. You could replace, so you're going to populate your token value here. It's going to automatically be passed in here as a second parameter, and you'll be good to go. So you, again, don't have to use keyring. I just do it not to expose my personal access tokens throughout these demos. All right, so we're going to use that to create a Tableau authentication object so that we're able to connect to our server. I'm going to specify which server I'm connecting to. So I'm on the 10AX instance. This is part of the developer program. All right, using that Tableau authentication object, I'm going to sign in. I'm going to use server.useHighestVersion to ensure that I'm using the most recent API version available for my Tableau server version. The next step I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a series of steps that I'm going to access individual endpoints that are that support various object types. So starting off, I'm going to gather all my users. So I'm going to create a list of user objects using the user's endpoint. Next thing I'm going to do with these user objects is I'm going to iterate through these user objects and populate their favorites. So if you don't populate their favorites, if you don't use this method for users, you're going to end up with a user object that has a favorites attribute with a value of none. So this object has a series of key value pairs. You're going to have an attribute that is populated with none. So go ahead and do this if you want to see the user's favorites, see what they favorited on the front end. If not, don't do it. Gather all groups. So same thing. We're going to use list comprehension to gather a list of group objects. We're going to use the groups endpoint. And then for each of those groups, we're going to populate the users. Again, this is like populate favorites. You have to use the method along with the group object to populate each group's members. So if you don't do this, you're going to see a users attribute that basically is empty, right? It's none. Typically, whenever you are working with groups, so you're working with the groups endpoint, you're going to want to be able to answer the question, okay, I have these groups, but who are its members? In that case, you're going to want to populate the users of each group. The next step is I'm going to create a data frame that's going to basically store all of my group information. So I have the group ID, group name, group domain, users. Again, I'm using list comprehension for that. These are largely the same. The only thing that's different is going to be the attribute for which we extract for each group. Here, there's a little nested list comprehension that's going to actually extract the user ID for each user in this list of users within each group. So 43 through 56, largely the same thing. We're going to access individual endpoints to get information relative or specific to a particular type of object or content type. So here we're going to get a list of all the projects. So these are the folders, if you will. So if you think file system on your local machine, it's pretty much like a file system. You're going to have folders, you're going to have subfolders. This is for the areas for which your content will reside. So we're going to use list comprehension again to get a list of all the project objects. We'll do the same thing for data sources, workbooks, views, flows, gather the flow run history using the flow runs endpoint, gather all the subscriptions using the subscriptions endpoint. So same thing, just different object types, different endpoints. And we're doing all this in advance because we want to actually, here in a moment, I'm going to create data frames specific to each of these object types. All right, so here's the first one, or the second one technically, because we did the group info up here. So for the user info, what I'm doing here is I'm creating a data frame. I'm extracting 4 attributes, so the user ID, the full name. I'm calling that display name. The reason I call this display name is because if you look on the front end of Tableau Server, it is actually called display name. The attributes with the API is called full name. Email address, site role. So is the user a creator, explorer, viewer, site admin, server administrator, etc. The next step here, I'm going to determine if the user is a content owner. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take each of those lists of objects that I created earlier. So for this case, I'm taking the flows objects. So up here I said flows. So create a list of flow objects. So these are all the flows that are on my server. I'm going to iterate through those and extract just their owner ID values. This is going to give me a list of flow owner ID values. Same thing for data sources, same thing for workbook owners. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to determine for each user, do they own content in terms of flows, data sources, or workbooks. All right, so here, what I'm doing is I'm getting a unique set of ID values across each list and consolidating those into one. There's multiple ways to do this. I chose to do it using sets and then updating the sets. So I've said, okay, give me the unique list of flow owners, data source owners, and workbook owners, respectively. And using sets, wrapping those around, that's going to take, say, if a user owns 10 flows, it's only going to represent their ID once in that list or in this set. Then going to update flow owners by appending the data source owners. Going to then update flow owners again by appending the unique workbook owner IDs. And by saying owners equals sets flow owners, I have technically a unique list of IDs that represents all of the owners across all content types. Well, in this case, flows, data sources, and workbooks. Like I said, many ways to do this is the way I chose to do it. Moving on, the users report. So I'm going to create a data frame. This users report is going to be the beginning of our users tab in our Excel workbook, or master workbook, or master report. I'm going to take the data frame user info that we saw up here. So it has 4 attributes. I'm going to create a derived attribute, so is owner, and that's going to be equal to this here. So this is just checking, okay, I have 10 users in my list. Let's just say I have 10 users on my server. Check for each of those user IDs in the user info data frame. Is it in the list of owners? And what owners is, again, is the content owners. So if it is, then true, otherwise false. I'm going to rename is owner to content owner, and then I'm going to sort the values by content owner. So if you look at this in the master report, you're going to see the content owners listed first. All right, so moving on. Gather all user favorites across each category type. So workbooks, flows, data sources, etc. I'm going to create a list of all favorites. So this is going to contain a list of data frames for each user's favorites. So if you watched my video on favorites, so the previous tutorial, you will learn that favorites are kind of complicated. The data structure used to store favorites, it's kind of complicated, so you got to do some rather complicated things. Maybe not complicated to you, complicated to me. But yeah, let's just get started. So for each user, I'm going to iterate through the users. I'm going to create a list of favorite categories. I'm going to create a list of favorite categories. So let's just say the favorite categories are workbooks, flows, and data sources. I'm going to first check, is that user's list of favorites for that particular content type, say workbook, is it populated? If it's not, then they don't have any favorites. So I don't need to actually create a data frame, an empty data frame for each of those content types. I only want to create a data frame for those for which the user has favorites for. All right, so for each of those categories that the user has favorites for, so if they have workbook favorites or flows favorites, I'm going to create a data frame. And then I'm going to go through row by row within those favorites, and I'm going to extract pieces of information from the favorite. So I'm going to extract the ID. So I'm using apply, and I'm saying lambda. So for each favorite, extract the ID. For each favorite, extract the name. Take the category, so whatever the category is. So if it's workbook, flow, or data source, make that title case. So I'm obsessive compulsive about this stuff. I like my reports to look, report ready and easily readable. So I'm going to capitalize this W, capitalize this F, and so forth. I'm going to extract the project ID if there is one. I'm using get at, so get attribute. It's going to check whether or not the attribute exists for that object. And if it does, then we're going to get the project ID. If it doesn't, I'm going to say not applicable. So this could be the case for which one does not have a project ID. So this could be parent projects, so top level projects. Moving forward, I'm going to say, get the project name. So if it has a project name, get it. Otherwise, not applicable. Also extract the user ID. So we're not actually extracting the user ID in this case because we're actually iterating through the user, right? So in this portion here, we are working with a particular user. We're working to gather their favorites. Because we are using the user object, we already have their attributes available. So I'm just going to say user ID is equal to the ID value within that user object and so forth. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to append that user's favorites. So each of these data frames for each of the categories. So there'll be one data frame per user, per content type they have a favorite for. I'm going to append all those data frames to this all favorites list. And then I'm going to finally come down here and I'm going to create one master favorites report by concatenating, so vertically concatenating those things, so unioning them, all those favorites data frames. I'm going to drop the columns favorites, don't need it. And then I'm going to rename, again, this is going to be completely optional. I am going to replace all the underscores, all the things that bug me, that's tell me or just kind of drive me crazy when I look at a report and I see not plain English column names if it's used for consumption purposes. It's one thing if you're storing it in a database or some other area, but if you're actually giving it to people, you need the columns to be in plain English and report friendly. So I'm going to replace all the underscores with spaces. So in this case, right, so user underscore email address, I'm going to replace these underscores with spaces. I'm then going to title case that. So it's going to be user with a capital U, email with a capital E, address with a capital A. And I'm going to replace any instances of ID with ID, but capitalized. All right. The next step, I'm going to take the group information data frame. So if we look at the group information data frame, what that's going to look like is there's going to be one row per group, and then there's going to be a corresponding list of users. So what you can expect, let's just say there's group 1, 2, 3. So an ID of 1, 2, 3. Within that row, there will be a group name, there will be a group domain, and there will be a list of users. So in the column called users, there will be a list object of the users that are members of that group. We don't want that though, right? So I don't want to store multiple values within a single intersection or cell. So what I want to do is I want to use the explode method to take that data frame and create one row per group per user. And that's going to make it easily digestible and consumable within modern BI tools and just for your readers in general, right? So if they go in the Excel workbook, the master report, they're going to be able to filter to a particular group. It's going to then show one row per user one row per user within that group. All right. I have the user ID values in that group information data frame, right? So if I come back up here I have the user ID values, but I don't have the important information that people are going to want to know, right? People don't memorize ID values. These are LUIDs, so they're unique identifiers used on the Tableau server that allow you to link objects together. And that's what we're going to do here in a second, so that we can actually extract the pieces of information people are going to know, right? Like the user's name, their email address, and so forth. So I'm going to come back down here, go back to my groups report, and I'm going to merge the project info and the user info data frames. So my groups report, that tab dedicated to speaking to groups, it's going to be the result of taking our groups info data frame and merging that with the user info data frame. We're going to do that with a left join. Why am I doing left? Okay, so you might have an instance where you have created a group, but you have not added any members to it. In that case, if you still want to represent that group within your report, despite not having any members, you'll need to use a left. If you use an inner join, well, you're going to be by default excluding that group. So I'm going to say left on users. So this is the column name within the group info data frame. This is the column name within the user info data frame, for which we're going to merge these two data frames on. I'm going to drop the redundant column user ID, because I'm getting a user ID from the list of users, right, in the group info data frame. Okay. Same idea. I'm going to create a product info data frame. I'm going to, for each of those projects, those project objects in the list of projects. So this project's value here that we're looking at, this is that pre-existing list of product objects that we extracted earlier from our server using the projects endpoint. So again, I created a list of project objects representing all projects or folders on my server. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a data frame passing, it's made up of a series of key value pairs. So the name of the column I want, and then the values. So what are the values? They're going to be the IDs, the names, the descriptions, the owner IDs, and the parent IDs for each of the projects in that list of projects. We're then going to create the products report. So this, when you look at this, don't get intimidated. I don't expect everyone to want or have the desire to do all this renaming, all this transformation. The reason I did this was because I want this report to be report friendly. I want people to look at it and understand, okay, given this column name, I understand immediately the contents of that column, right? In my head, I know the domain of that attribute. So what I've done here is I've taken the product info data frame, which you just saw here. So it has these 5 attributes. I've merged it with the product info data frame. So why did I do this? Why did I merge it with another copy of itself? Well, within our folder structures, our product structures, you have parent folders and you have child folders. So just think on your file system, you have a folder and you click into it, you drill into it, you see other folders. What I wanted to do is to be able to say, okay, for this folder that's represented in this row, here's the parent folder information. So I'm just going to take 2 copies of that and join or merge based on the parent project ID being the project ID in the other version of the same data frame. I'm going to create suffixes with this. So in the first data frame, I'm going to not have suffixes. In the second data frame, I'm going to have a suffix of space parent, and you'll see why here in a moment. I'm going to drop some of the columns resulting from this merge. So I'm going to drop the redundant parent project ID parent, project ID parent. I'm then going to rename some columns. So I'm going to rename project name parent to parent project name, project description parent to parent project description. So this is telling me within every row, okay, I have a project. Here's its ID, here's its name, here's the description, blah, blah, blah. And then in the subsequent columns, here's the parent project information. This tells me where this folder sits, right? So we have that. I'm then going to merge the user info data frame that we created above that speaks to user objects, right? So the user's ID, their full name, their email address, their site role. I'm going to do a left join on that, and I'm going to say, okay, join on or merge on the project owner ID value equaling the user ID value in the user info data frame. Why am I doing this? Well, it's going to allow me to get the project owner's information. I'm going to drop the redundant column, so user ID. I'm then going to rename some columns. So I'm going to take user display name, so the user that owns the project. So I'm going to rename that to project owner name, and then do the same thing for the other attributes, right? So product owner email address, product owner site role. It's very clear who this user is and what role they play within this row. They're the owner of the project. Same idea. Let's go ahead and merge again the user info. And this time we're going to get the parent project owner's information. So this is, again, the parent project. So we have within one row, we have the project and then the parent's project information. We're going to get the user information for both of those projects, not only the project represented in the row, but also the parent project information that's captured there too. Going through the same process, renaming some columns. I'm then going to do this. I'm going to re-index the columns. So basically this is fancy word or method in Pandas for reordering the columns. So I'm going to put the project information first. So all the way through the description. And then I'm going to say, okay, this is the project information. Okay, who owns that project? I'm going to follow up with that information. And then I'm going to list out the parent project information and then the parent project owner's information. So I've ordered these columns or sequenced them in such a way that I think makes sense, right? So if I'm a reader and I'm reading left to right, these columns are grouped together based on the theme, right? So the project information, the project owner's information, the parent project information, followed by the parent project information. Okay, moving on, data source info. Same idea, create a data frame, extract attributes for each of the data sources in the list of data source objects that we created using the data sources endpoints above. All right, so we have quite a few attributes. I'm then going to create a report. So this is going to be the report you see in the master workbook or master report that we'll see here in a moment. I'm going to take the data source info data frame, merge that with the user info data frame. So same kind of idea as most of these objects. I need to pull in the user info associated with that object, right? So who owns the data source? Who owns the workbook? Who owns the project? Who owns the flow? That's super useful, right? So if you give somebody a report that says, hey, here's the data sources, here's their ID, the owner ID, name, type, etc., a follow-up question immediately is going to be, okay, you gave me a data owner ID, but who is that? Who actually owns this data source? So just go ahead and put it in there, right? It makes no sense to create one of these reports without the user information associated with the object or the owner. All right, so whenever we do these merges, we are going to result in a redundant column. So user ID from the user info data frame, that's going to match the data source owner ID because, well, that's how we joined, right? We merged on that. All right, so we dropped that. We renamed some columns. So data source owner name, data source owner email address. These are just key value pairs. The way it works is you provide the old, and then you provide the new as the value. So key, old, value, new. Reindex, just again, moving around the columns in a way that I think makes sense and makes this Excel worksheets report friendly. One of the key things here that you don't have to do for a lot of objects is in order to write this to an Excel workbook, I actually need to remove the time zone information. If you try to run this and you try to write this data, so this data that is time zone aware to Excel, it's going to give you an error. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this column, say .dt, so .datetime, so Pandas is datetime, .tz underscore localize, so basically provide no time zone, right? So it's basically going to strip off the time zone information. Workbook info, same idea, create a data frame that's going to extract the pertinent attributes for each of those workbook objects within the list of workbooks that we extracted previously using the workbooks endpoint. One of the things I did here, because I think it's important, so when we think about the things we build, there's a saying that says, build it and they will come. You will, without a doubt, experience in your lifetime, if you're doing dashboard development, that everything you build is not a big hit. Sometimes you'll build something, you'll spend hours on it or weeks on it, and then you go and you look at the consumption or the usage, and you're like, wow, nobody's looking at this, and you wonder why. Well, to actually figure out why, you need to know that there's actually an issue. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a data frame that captures the total views per workbook. To do that, I'm going to create a data frame that makes use of the view objects that we extracted. I'm basically going to take the keys. Those are going to be the columns. And for every object or every view in that list of views, those values associated with each of those keys are going to be the rows. I'm going to group it by the workbook ID because I want to get the total views per workbook, right? So a view here, think of a worksheet in your workbook, right? So if your workbook has 4 worksheets and they're published for viewership, so your users can view them, we're going to total up those views per workbook. So I'm going to have one row per workbook ID in the corresponding total views. So I'm going to sum those. I'm going to reset the index. This is just something that's necessary so that you have something that looks more like a row column storage as opposed to a crosstab. I'm going to rename the columns. So instead of underscore workbook ID, I'm going to say workbook ID. Again, report friendly, plain English, underscore total views, workbook total views. I'm then going to take my workbook's info data frame, right? The original data frame that's here, that's just very simple. It's capturing one row per workbook and the corresponding information associated with that workbook. I'm going to take that and I'm going to join it to our total views per workbook. Why I'm going to do this? Again, within each of those rows, I want to say, hey, here's my workbook, here's all the information, but here's also the usage of that workbook, right? How many views does it have? So I'm going to merge that on workbook ID because they should match, right? I'm then going to do the merge you've seen throughout this script. I'm going to merge on the user info data frame so that I can get the user information associated with the owner, right? So who owns this workbook? I'm going to drop the redundant column, the results from the merge. I'm going to do some renaming. So again, key value pairs, keys are the old column names, values are the new column names. I'm going to then reorder my columns around in a way that I think makes it easier to consume this report. And same thing like I had to do with data sources. For the created that and updated that timestamps, I need to strip off the time zone. Moving on to flows. So we've done quite a few contents objects so far. So we've done projects, groups, users, favorites. We've done data sources and workbooks. Now we're on to flows. And we're doing most of the same thing, right? You just got to get used to working with these endpoints and understanding which attributes each object has and how to work with them. Okay, so the flow info, it's just a data frame. We're going to take each of those flows we extracted from the flows endpoint. So this is our list of flows. We're going to say, hey, give me the ID, owner ID, name, project name, and web page URL for each of those flows. Create a data frame. So here are our columns, our values, so forth. The flow run history. So I'm going to create the data frame that uses the flow runs endpoint, and we captured that in our runs, our list of flow runs above. Why am I doing this? Well, I want to understand, okay, for each of these flows, how long are they taking? So how many times have they been ran? What's their total duration, their average duration? Out of all the runs for that particular flow, what was the longest run? What was the shortest run? And what is the range? But so when I say the range, I mean the maximum runtime minus the minimum runtime. And that's what you're going to see here. So we're creating a flow run summary that's going to capture the execution summary for each of those flows. We're going to take the original data frame, which is just two attributes. I'm going to group all of those runs associated with each flow. And I'm going to take the run duration and perform an aggregation. So the count, sum, mean, max, and min. And that's going to stand for the run count, the total duration, average duration, maximum duration, and minimum duration. I then go on to use the assign method, so the data frame.assign, to create the range. So I use a lambda. I say, okay, duration range is going to be equal to, so for each flow, take the flow's maximum duration and the flow's minimum duration, compute that difference, and that's going to be our duration range. I'm going to reset the index so that's more row column. I'm going to take out one of the levels, so it's not like crosstab looking. And then I'm going to rename those things, right? So each of those aggregations, they come out looking like this and this, and I'm just going to rename this to be report friendly so people know what I'm talking about definitively. All right, so what I want to do here is I believe each of these comes out with a time delta object. So each of these computations is a time delta object that gives you days, hours, minutes, seconds. I don't want to have people look at the placeholders and determine, okay, is this like how many seconds is this or how many minutes is this? When you think about flows, most flows should take in minutes. Many will take in seconds. So what I've done is I've just converted all of these time delta objects or these values to total seconds. So I've done that by taking the original values and setting it equal to the original value using date time, not total seconds. So convert 3 minutes to seconds, right? Or 5 minutes to seconds, or just the time delta value, right? Extract the seconds from that. But if it's more than 60 seconds, do the conversion. All right. So then we are going to take that data frame that we've created. So I'm going to have a flows report. This is going to be, again, this is going to be the tab with my master report that's dedicated to to flows. So I'm going to take the flow info data frame. I'm going to merge that with the user info. Same idea. Let's get the owner information associated with this flow. So who owns the flow? I'm going to then merge again. I'm going to merge the flow run summary. So this is going to say, okay, I have one row per flow. Within that row, I have the flow information. I have the user information associated with the owner, the person that owns the flow. And I also have the flow run summary information. So tell me about this flow. How fast is it on average? How, what's the longest it's run? What's the shortest it's run? What's, on average, how long does it run? So the range. And then how many times is it executed? All right, so that's the flows. Subscriptions, same idea. Create a data frame, extract important attributes from each of the subscription objects. And then we're going to create a report here in a moment to do that. But what I'm doing here is I'm getting the subscription information, I'm creating a separate data frame, and then I'm going to actually get view info. So the view info is basically going to be, so we have these subscriptions, right? And we have, so it says, Chris is subscribed to XYZ. Well, XYZ is going to be an ID, and the target type is going to be a workbook or a view. It is not enough to say that, hey, there's 50 subscriptions associated with this ID, this target ID. So the target ID is, again, what the user is getting in their mailbox. It could be a PDF, it could be an image, it could be both. What are they getting in their mailbox that's associated with the content that's published on the Tableau server? Everyone is going to want to know that looks at this report when it comes to subscriptions. Okay, I see that there's 50 people receiving something with this, whatever the content is associated with this ID, but what is it? That's why we're going to pull in the view information. We're going to pull in the workbook information that's associated with each of these subscriptions. So what is the user receiving so that we can identify, okay, what is highly subscribed to, and maybe try to recreate that success or understand why it is and maybe why something isn't. So we're going to create a data frame called view info. For each of the views on our server, we're going to extract the content ID, the owner ID, the name, the URL for which the view resides. So if you're on your front end of Tableau server and you click into the workbook, you're going to see the list of sheets / views. And it's going to, the URL is going to update, right? So I've Frankensteined this URL together. Unfortunately, the state of the API right now does not return when you look for content URL or the web page URL, the actual attributes for each view, it doesn't return a valid URL. It's a snippet of one. It's not useful by itself. So I've kind of Frankensteined the server address value, the my known site name, and just the structure. I know the structure of the URL, so I'm just going to Frankenstein a few pieces of information together. So for each of the views, I'm going to basically hand make this content URL so that's usable. So when I send people this information via workbook, they can click the URLs and navigate to that sheet, as opposed to going to Tableau server and going in the search bar and typing in the view name and hoping that there's not multiple or, seemingly related views. All right, so that's to get the views. Again, we're doing that because we want to be able to tell more about the subscription. So what is the person subscribed to? So if it's a view, so if the target type is a view and not a workbook, I want to be able to provide that information. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a content info data frame that takes this view data frame and concatenates it with the workbook info data frame. Because in the workbook info data frame, we have the workbook ID, we have the owner ID, we have the name and the content URL. I just need to union these two things, right? I need to vertically merge these or vertically append these two things together. So it's going to create one data frame that has a list of all the views and all the workbooks that are on my server. If I have that master list, then I can pull in the associated information, so whether it's a view or a workbook, for each of these ID values. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to merge these two data frames together. So we're going to merge the subscription info data frame and the content info data frame, which is, again, the result of vertically appending the workbook info data frame with just this subset of columns, renaming some of the columns, and then I'm appending that view info data frame. I've done this renaming here because I want these to vertically align together, right? So if I take these two data frames, I want all of this information to line up. All right, and so in our subscriptions report, we're taking the subscription info, we're merging with the content info, like I mentioned earlier. So this is going to allow us to say, hey, here's subscription X, and here's the content associated with that subscription. It's telling us what is the user subscribed to, particularly the contents, not just the ID, but the name of the view or workbook, the owner of the workbook in view, which we're going to get from the user info data frame whenever we merge this. I drop a redundant column. I drop a redundant column here. Do some renaming, again, doing some renaming using key value pairs. So keys, the old name, new name is the value. Merging again with user info, because I had to merge user info to merge with the subscription info, right? So this first merge is telling me, okay, this is a subscription, and it's telling me who owns that subscription. The second merge for user info is actually going to tell me, okay, this is the subscription, and here's the content the owner is receiving via email. But who owns that content, right? So if I receive a subscription and it's for the executive dashboard, well, this is going to tell me when I merge with the content owner ID and the user ID, it's going to tell me who owns the piece of content that I'm subscribed to. This is critical, right? If you're thinking about looking at data behind what is the most what's highly subscribed to, we want to know who created that, right? Maybe have a chat with them and understand how they manage that success. So another dropping of a redundant column, renaming columns, re-indexing. Again, this is me wanting to create a report that's friendly to use, easy to use, and the themes of data are together, right? I don't have columns and themes of attributes all spread apart. So I have the subscription information. So let's just go here. This is the subscription information, so the information that's tied directly to the subscription. The person that owns the subscription. The content type, so is it a view or a workbook? The information associated with that content, so what is its name, what is the URL, so where can it be found, who owns it, and then the owner's information. So we come full circle there, right? So I can say there's 500 subscriptions. Here are the owners of those subscriptions. Here are what those subscriptions are tied to. So what is being subscribed to, and here is the information associated with the user that owns that information, that content. All right, now we're at the very bottom here. This is the easy part. We're using our pathlib object, so I'm creating a path using pathlib. I am going to call my report master report. It's in this folder, tutorial 12. I'm appending the date and time to this file name, because again, I want to understand when this report was run. And I also don't want to overwrite a pre-existing report in the same file path or the same directory. This portion here is going to allow me to write each of these reports that we've just spoken about to individual sheets. It's critical that you make sure that you list these out here as opposed to doing one writer object per file. If you do that, you're basically going to overwrite the file when you write each report. So I'm saying I'm using one writer object, using the write path, which is the pathlib, and to that file, while it's open, I'm going to create these sheets. If you do something like if you were to take this and do this, copy and paste this, and basically have something like this for each report, you would just be overwriting that. So at the end, you would probably just have a master report. So you'd have a master report, but its contents would just be the subscriptions report with one tab or worksheet called subscriptions. All right, that was a lot. Let's take a look at what we would have created. So if I open up this report, what we're going to see is we're going to see one tab per object that we were interested in, and then we just walk through. So let me share my screen. So you can see my Excel now, and you'll see that we have one tab per report that we generated. So we have a user report, favorites report, groups, projects, data sources, workbooks, flows, and subscriptions. We have 2 users, so 1 row per user, the corresponding information. We have a favorites tab or report that contains 1 row per favorite, information that corresponds to each favorite, along with the user that owns that favorite. We have a groups report that's 1 row per group and per corresponding user. So if we have what we're seeing here is we have a group. There's 2 groups here technically, but 4 rows. That's because within each of these groups, there are 2 users. So again, granularity of this is 1 row per group per user within that group. We have a projects report. We have 1 row per project. We have the project information and the associated owner of that project's information. And if there is a parent project, so if the project is not a top level project or does not have a parent or has a parent, then then you're going to see the parent project information in here. All right, so we have a data sources report, 1 row per data source, the data source information, the ID, name, type, etc., along with the user information associated with the owner, right? Who owns that data source? We have a workbooks report, 1 row per workbook, information associated with the workbook, along with the total views for that workbook, the content URL, the project that it sits within, and then the user information associated with the owner. Same thing with flows, 1 row per flow. We have the flow information that we captured from the flows endpoints for each of those flow objects existing on my server. And then we have the flow run summary information that we computed separately, right? So we merged these 2 data frames together, and we ended up being able to get these metrics for each of the flows. Subscriptions, 1 row per subscription. We have the subscription information, the schedule, the user that owns the subscription, so who's it's being sent to. We have the content type, so is it a view or a workbook? We have the content information, so what is it? What's being sent to the user? And we have the owner information associated with the content, right? So this is, again, the person that owns the content that is subscribed to. All right, so then let's do one last thing before we wrap this up. Let's go ahead and go to my server and check out what this looks like on my server. All right, so if you look here, we're just double checking, what's occurred here. So we have 4 top level projects. We have 8 projects total. We have 5 workbooks, 20 views, 11 data sources, 4 flows. Let's just check some of these real quick, right? So if we go back to our report, if we go back to Excel, we can check, okay, 4 flows, 8 projects, 4 groups. I don't think we saw that here and there back on that other page though. We have 11 data sources. So this matches exactly with what I pulled, what you're seeing visibly on the front end, right? So this report's accurate. It's capturing all the information that you're seeing here on the front end. If we go to users, there's 2 users. We saw that previously. There's 2 groups. We saw that previously. So again, super useful. In order to do this without this script, it just wouldn't be a fun time. So you could use the Postgres database. You could explore the Postgres database that sits behind this server. So whether you're on cloud or Tableau server, you could use that. You could write a bunch of SQL to get that together. You could, and you could output that to that information to your Tableau server. But what this script allows you to do is allows you to do it programmatically via Python. It allows you to write that output to an Excel file for dissemination purposes. You could, again, turn around and publish that to your server too. But yeah, multiple ways to do things. This is one way, super efficient. If you're thinking, hey, maybe why don't I just copy and paste this stuff? It's not that easy. So if you come here, you try to copy and paste this stuff, like just highlighting this. If you paste this into an Excel or any type of file, it's gonna be a mess. It's not fun to deal with, especially when you have hundreds, right? Scrolling down, scrolling up, super easy to run this script. This script, if you have thousands of objects, so I've done this for about a server that has 1,000 workbooks, about 500 flows, 1,600 users, so forth. Pretty large server. It takes maybe, depending on how you've written this, so if you use the script I've written, it should take you like two minutes maybe at most. If you go back to the script and you start, so if you edit my script here, so if I go back to Visual Studio Code, if you go back here and you start updating things like the user data frame, so if you have a ton of users and you need the user domain too, so there is an attribute called domain. If you start extracting each of those domains, unfortunately, the way this API is set up currently, the endpoints, that's another separate call. So you get the user information, but then you have to make a separate call to get their domain. It's the same thing that you're having to do here for populating the groups of users, the same thing you're having to do for populating the user's favorites. So these are separate calls, right? We make one call to get the user object. It brings in 90+% of the information we need, but then we have to make a separate call to populate the favorites, to populate the users, and so forth. But yeah, I mean, this script should run in a handful of minutes and generate the desired report. Okay, well, that wraps up this video on generating a master report. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server through automation. In the next 3 tutorials, I will walk you through automating data refreshes. I'll cover triggering the execution of flows, linked tasks, and extract refreshes programmatically. If you enjoyed this video,
then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.